Well, good morning, everyone. Lovely to see you all again. Appreciate it, Walter. So, last week, we were looking at starting to look at the last section of Habakkuk chapter 2. We had read earlier the initial section about God's condemnation against the Babylonians, what's going to happen to them, and then how he interjects in there in verses 13 and 14 his ultimate plan, a wonderful, refreshing reminder for us all about there is an end goal to this all, that God does not just want to lead the world in destruction. He does not just want to end the Babylonians, but he actually has a plan for where the knowledge of the glory of the Lord will cover the sea, or cover as the waters of the sea. So we talked a little bit about how that could be a lesson for us. We talked about how we can see Jesus in the fulfillment of this. And before moving on into the last section of chapter 2, I was curious if there were any closing thoughts about verses 13 and 14, and I'll reread it. Is it not indeed from the Lord of hosts that the labor of the people only feeds the fire, and the nations weary themselves in vain? And 14, where it says, for the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. Just curious if there were any other thoughts that this struck throughout the week or anything along that nature. All right, I don't see anyone's hands at this time. So let us continue on with the reading of verses 15 to 20 of chapter 2 in the book of Habakkuk. And if I could get a volunteer for that, I'd greatly appreciate that.
I can start us off. 15 through 22.
20, yeah.
Woe to him who makes his neighbors drink. You pour on wrath and make them drunk, in order to gaze at their nakedness. You will have your fill of shame instead of glory. Drink yourself and show your uncircumcision. The cup in the Lord's right hand will come around to you, and utter shame will come upon your glory. The violence done to Lebanon will overwhelm you, as will the destruction of the beasts that terrified them. For the blood of man and violence to the earth, to cities and all who dwell in them. What profit is an idol when its maker has shaped it of metal image, a teacher of lies? For its maker trusts in his own creation when he makes speechless idols. Woe unto him who says a wooden thing, awake, to a silent stone, arise. Can this teach? Behold, it is overlaid with gold and silver, and there is no breath in it at all. But the Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before him.
Much. So when I first read those verses 15 and 16 ended up really standing out to me. There's a couple different ways that Habakkuk could have potentially taken those words. One potentially being a caution to a certain lifestyle. And we kind of talked about that idea that there's a lot of things that God talks about in relation to the Babylonians that would be something for us to avoid. He could have also recognized the impending judgment against Babylon because of this lifestyle, and then potentially a springboard into the other references in God's word about wine. And that's where my brain ended up going. I read these verses, and a count in Genesis immediately jumped to my mind. I would like to get a reader for Genesis chapter 9, verses 20 to 27, please.
Genesis 9, 20 to 27. And Noah began to be an husbandman and planted a vineyard. And he drank of the vine and was drunken, and he was uncovered within his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father, and told his two brethren without. And Shem and Japheth took a garment and laid it upon their shoulders, and went backward, and covered the nakedness of their father, and their faces were backward, and they saw not their father's nakedness. And Noah awoke from his wine, and knew what his younger son had done unto him. And he said, Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants, shall he be unto his brethren. And he said, Blessed be the Lord God of Shem, and Canaan shall be a servant. God shall enlarge Japheth, and he shall dwell in the tents of Shem, and Canaan shall be a servant.
My brain went to Noah and this encounter with Ham, because it seems very similar in the language, and may potentially shed some of the light that I've always found missing in relation to why does Noah get so upset with his son Ham and then his grandson Canaan? What caused that level of animosity? And it could have been potentially that Ham and Canaan had maybe done something similar to what Babylon did with the nations, where they were giving a drink to expose their nakedness. And because I started looking at that and looking up other references of where wine appeared, it revealed a small little micro study of wine in the Bible and the significance thereof. Of course, we all know that wine is an alcoholic beverage that is caused by the fermentation of grapes. But in Scripture, there seems to be more to it than just simply a drink that tastes good depending on your taste buds. There appears to be a positive where they use it as a source of joy, gladness. There's also the source of negativeness where those who drink too much end up being slothful and not accomplishing anything. There's a element of wrath as well attributed to it, as well as the source of life. In this next section we're going to read, I would like you all to think about Jesus and the family line that he comes from. So in Genesis 49, verses 8 through 12, we'll get to read a prophecy in relation to Judah given to him by his father Jacob. Can I get a reader for that, please?
Judah, your brothers shall praise you. Your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's sons shall bow down before you. Judah is a lion's cub from the prey. My son, you have gone up. He stood down, he crouched as a lion, and as a lioness, who dares rouse him? The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until tribute comes to him. And to him shall the obedience of the peoples, binding his foal to the vine, and his donkey's colt to the choice vine. He has washed his garments in wine, and his vesture in the blood of grapes. His eyes are darker than wine, and his teeth whiter than milk.
Thank you. Here we get to see a lot of symbology, a lot of things that tie to Jesus. But I found intriguing that the donkey, or potentially his means for traveling, is tied to the vine, potentially a grapevine, and that Judah is prophesied or is promised as being the one who washes his clothes in the wine, which is intriguing to think about if it all relates to Jesus being the Lion of Judah and how through him is a source of life through his blood, and that he walked a life tethered to God. So the idea is that everything that showed about him shows the life of God. Everything that he walked through was connected to God. And it just, for me, I may be reading a little too much into this, but it looks like when it talks about the donkey and it talks about potentially the garments washed in wine, that it could have some characteristics that are very similar to how Jesus lived. I'm always curious about people's thoughts about that, but it was something that jumped out to me that I had not realized until I looked at this word. Now, on the other side of things, Solomon talks about a wine of violence. Now, if I'm going too fast and we want to talk about something, please don't feel free to interject. And for that, we will turn over to Proverbs 4, verses 10 through 19.
Hear, my son, and accept my sayings, and the years of your life will be many. I have directed you in the way of wisdom. I have led you in upright paths. When you walk, your steps will not be impeded, and if you run, you will not stumble. Take hold of instruction, do not let go. Guard her, for she is your life. Do not enter the path of the wicked, and do not proceed in the way of evil men. Avoid it, do not pass by it. Turn away from it and pass on. For they cannot sleep unless they do evil, and they are robbed of sleep unless they make someone stumble. For they eat the bread of wickedness and drink the wine of violence. But the path of the righteous is like the light of dawn that shines brighter and brighter until the full day. The way of the wicked is like darkness. They do not know over what they stumble.
Thank you very much. Here we get to see the portrayal of two different lives. One life seeming to be more spiritual, more godlike, potentially what you could say more along the line of the blood of Christ. The other one, the blood of violence, or the wine of violence. And I think there's a lot of symbology between Christ's life and his blood being in the wine, and potentially that idea traveling over into here. And when we look at that, I believe there's an opportunity for us to see wine as being the way of life. How are we actually going to live our life? What are we ingesting? What is the defining characteristics? Are we going to take in and ingest the wine of violence, or are we going to, in the world, or are we going to ingest and take in the blood, the wine of Christ? I thought that was a very interesting parallel. And the question then comes, what is the life that we are ingesting? Are we ingesting a life that is more like the world, where we're taking in all that, or are we actually doing one that's filled with Christ and God? I thought that was a interesting point that Solomon kind of brings out by, once again, using wine as a source for a mentality or a characteristic. Now, in relation to God's wrath, which is another aspect of wine, we read that in Psalm 75, verses 1 through 10. And I would like to also read that. I apologize if I'm flying through some of these. If there's something that you guys want to linger on or comment, please don't feel free to mention it.
Unto thee, O God, do we give thanks unto thee? Do we give thanks? For that thy name is near, thy wondrous works declare. When I shall receive the congregation, I will judge uprightly. The earth and all the inhabitants thereof are dissolved. I bear up the pillars of it. I said unto the fools, deal not foolishly, and to the wicked, lift not up the horn. Lift not up your horn on high, speak not with a stiff neck. For promotion cometh near from the east, nor from the west, nor from the south, but God is the judge. He putteth down one, and setteth up another. For in the hand of the Lord there is a cup, and the wine is red. It is full of mixture, and he poureth out of the same. But the dregs thereof, all the wicked of the earth shall wring them out and drink them. But I will declare forever, I will sing praises to the God of Jacob. How far is it? Okay. And the horns of the wicked also will I cut off, but the horns of the righteous shall be exalted.
Appreciate it. Here we get to see Asaph bringing out the point that we kind of already covered in Habakkuk, which is from God comes both the life to the just and death to the wicked, and how from the cup of God you can either get and receive life, kind of like what we were talking about earlier in Sunday school when we were doing the memory verse, the idea that God gives us grace. He also will bring about judgment. And I think Asaph brings that out by talking about the ultimate end to those who choose to live a wicked life. I'm sorry, there's just a lot here that I didn't realize initially when I was looking at this idea of wine. And it was something that Jeremiah brings out very vividly and very clearly about God's wine of wrath in Jeremiah chapter 25. And I would like to get verses 15 to 27 read, if that's possible.
Jeremiah 25, you said 15 to 27?
Yes, please.
For thus saith Lord God of Israel unto me, take the wine cup of this fury at my hand, and cause all the nations to whom I send to thee to drink it. And they shall drink it and be moved and be mad, because of the sword that I will send among them. Then took I the cup at the Lord's hand, and made all the nations to drink unto whom the Lord had sent me, to wit, Jerusalem and the cities of Judah, and the kings thereof, and the princes thereof, to make them a desolation, an astonishment, and hissing, and a curse. And it is this day. Pharaoh king of Egypt, and his servants, and his princes, and all his people, and all the mingled people, and all the kings of the land of Uz, and all the kings of the land of the Philistines, and Ashkelon, and Ascah, and Ekron, and the remnant of Ashdod, and Edom, and Moab, and the children of Ammon, and all the kings of Tyrus, and all the kings of Zidon, and all the kings of the isles which are beyond the sea, Dedan, and Tema, and Buz, and all that are in the utmost corners, and all the kings of Arabia, and all the kings of the mingled people that dwell in the desert, and all the kings of Zimri, and all the kings of Elam, and all the kings of the Medes, and all the kings of the north, far and near, one with another, and all the kingdoms of the world, which are upon the face of the earth, and the king of Shishak shall drink after them. Therefore thou shalt say unto them, Thus saith the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, Drink ye and be drunken, and spew, and fall, and rise no more, because of the sword which I will send among you.
So for context, Jeremiah is prophesying, and it actually opens up this chapter by saying that he is prophesying in the first year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. So this is way before Nebuchadnezzar has actually gone out and started fighting all these nations. And we see that even a little earlier, we would have seen that this is written out also as a judgment against the king of Babylon. So even as he's coming out here, he is also still being told that you're not going to actually be getting off scot-free. I'm actually using you as a source of my wrath, and then I'm also going to distribute my wrath upon you. Later on in Jeremiah, and this was almost a full chapter thing, and it's very hard to limit it down, but in Jeremiah 51, verses 1 through 11, we actually get to see this final end, this final destruction against Babylon that's caused by the pouring out of God's wrath. And it was such a powerful image. The whole chapter really is something that should be read, but we'll just stop with verses 1 through 11 in this case.
Thus saith the Lord, Behold, I will raise up against Babylon, and against them that dwell in the midst of them, that rise up against me, a destroying wind. And I will send unto Babylon fanners, and they shall fan her, and shall empty her land, and in the day of trouble they shall be against her round about. Against him that bendeth, let the archer bend his bow, and against him that lifteth himself up in his Brigidine, and spare ye not her young men, destroy ye utterly all her host. Thus the slain shall fall in the land of the Chaldeans, and they that are thrust through in her streets. For Israel hath not been forsaken, nor Judah of his God, of the Lord of hosts, through their land was once filled with sin against the Holy One of Israel. Flee out of the midst of Babylon, and deliver every man his soul. Be not cut off in her iniquity, for this is the time of the Lord's vengeance. He will render unto her a recompense. Babylon hath been a golden cup in the Lord's hand, and that made all the earth drunken. The nations have drunken her wine, therefore the nations are mad. Babylon is suddenly fallen and destroyed. Howl for her, take balm for her pain, if so be she may be healed. We would have healed Babylon, but she is not healed. Forsake her, and let us go every one into his own country, for her judgment reacheth unto this heaven, and she is lifted up even to the skies. The Lord hath brought forth our righteousness. Come and let us declare in Zion the work of the Lord our God. Make bright the arrows, gather the shields. The Lord hath raised up the spirit of the kings of the Medes. For his device is against Babylon to destroy it, because it is the vengeance of the Lord, the vengeance of his temple.
In Jeremiah 51, we got to see how God's wine of wrath being poured out on Babylon, but we also got to see how Babylon was a wine that came out of God's cup to madden the nations. And this language is something that Brother Roger Anderson, I think, really did a good job covering in his series of classes on the book of Revelation, where it really does talk about Babylon as an unclean spirit and being the source of all immorality. And it's interesting how this thread starts all the way back in Jeremiah and Habakkuk, but is still continuing all the way on into Revelation, and how everything, I just find it interesting how everything just comes full circle, that this idea that we just read in, what we read in Habakkuk 15 and 16, where they are the sources of madness, in relation to actually what Babylon themselves did, is still something that is harkened back to in relation to the end times, and how they are still affecting us. It was something I thought intriguing. Sister Ellen?
Okay, I think all examples you've given have been about wine, but I was thinking of other times that God made people drink, like the Israelites, and they powdered a golden calf and had to drink that. And then the law about the jealous husband, the wife had to drink this liquid, which, if she was guilty of something, would cause punishment too. So it wasn't just wine, it's just kind of motif or something.
Right. Absolutely. No, wasn't thinking about those because my focus was just on that wine, but that is very true, that God does use other things to bring out punishment or judgment. It just, with us as Christians who look at and have such a significance with the idea of wine in relation to Christ, and we look at the wine as a symbol of his blood, it was just it's almost hard not to try to look into that and see what was going on there, how deeply everything is interconnected, and how you could look at wine and as a means of, this is what I'm ingesting for what is my actual life, what am I reflecting, to this being the source of God's wrath as well. That's what I just thought that was a interesting, somewhat side note, but something that I think God wanted to use through looking at Habakkuk, because of the fact that it is so integral to some of the plans he has in relation to this world. Yes.
When we think about what you kind of just said, the blood of Christ and ingesting that, but in that verse from Jeremiah 51, it specifically says when the nations drank of her wine, or that Babylonian wine. So that's what they were ingesting, was Babylon, instead of, a Christ-like something to take into themselves. And that's when they went mad or crazy.
makes sense because you see, I think what is a definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results, right? And I think God kind of shows us that without Him, you're going to reach the point of insanity if you keep on trying to do something without getting any results because you don't have Him as your actual backing. And that's, I think, what the nations have done. If you look at the nations in general, every nation has seemed to have a general trend that they have all followed and doing the exact same things all the way up until their ultimate demise and fall. And you would think that finally someone learned to do something different from the rest of the nations. I mean, even to this modern day age, but we're still just seeming to repeat that trend of madness where we'll ultimately fall and have to rely on Christ. But yeah. Any other thoughts? Brother Jason?
It talks about Habakkuk talking about making each other drink and get drunk, and it reminds me of Thessalonians. Apostle Paul kind of talks about that a little bit too. He talks about, therefore let us not sleep as others do, but let us watch and be sober. For those who sleep at night, and those who get drunk at night. But let us who are of the day be sober and put on the breastplate of faith and love and the helmet of salvation. And it's kind of interesting that Paul uses that same kind of metaphor, that imagery of being asleep or drunk in contrasting that with being faithful and being awake and sober. And that was kind of what was happening in Habakkuk's day as well, as the people were, they were kind of being drunken. And like you said, it was the influence of the nations around them. They were so intrigued with what they were doing that they were not, as that passage before talks about, filled with the knowledge of God. They were filled with all the things of the surrounding nations that were unclean, that were leading them away from the Lord, these bad habits, and they were not really serving God. So it's just kind of interesting that theme gets picked up even for the early believers in Paul's time. It's like you got to stay awake and be sober of mind and not be under the influences of the darkness around you.
Verse?
Oh, it's 1 Thessalonians, it's chapter 5, and then starting in verse 6 through 8.
6 through 8. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Yeah, I think we can take something good and turn it into something that's not good. Say, water is man's best friend, but it can also kill you. Fire, you need fire, but it can also harm you, can kill you. And Paul tells Timothy, drink, don't just drink water, drink wine for your health and your ailments. But if it's done without moderation and an abundance, it's just like fire and water. It harms you, it kills you. So, we have to look at it and not take blessings from God and use them in ways that will harm us or harm others. Similarly, in Galatians 5, fruits of the Spirit, we have fleshly ways, drunkenness being one of them, and then you have all the other hatred, selfish ambition, and the like. But then, we have to become something other than what's natural to us, and that's to, produce fruit, which is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. So if we use God's gifts properly, we become something that is useful to God and not destructive. So.
I think yeast is kind of on that same level too. That's something that's an example of sin almost continuously in the Bible, but then in one example it's used as a metaphor for the kingdom of God and its growth too. Yeast? Yeah. Kind of the source of wine, too.
Forgot to turn on my microphone. You think about yeast being the yeast of the Pharisees versus that wasn't. I don't know exactly where I wanted to go with that, but I thought, oh man. But yeah, no, you're right. There is that reference as well. Now, it is interesting that this is actually the kind of the source for the ultimate destruction of the Babylonians, is this desire to drink wine to the point of being drunk. If we remember in our reading a couple weeks ago with Belshazzar, they have this big giant wedding banquet, or not wedding banquet, but they have this banquet. And when you look more into the rulings of the time, Belshazzar was reigning technically with his father, who was going off and trying to do a lot of archaeological rebuilds and things like that. And that it resulted in a new change of who was their primary patron god, being the god Sin. And it's interesting because according to a historian named Gathir Teluni, a plausible reconstruction for how Babylon fell, they were able to see a forced entry into Babylon, and he proposed that the portion of the Persian army under the command of General Ugbaru penetrated a gate on the west side of the Euphrates, then crossed the river to take the eastern districts of Babylon. And this may be the source of the story that we may have commonly heard growing up, which was the Persian army diverting the Euphrates, entering along Babylon along the riverbed, which completely surprised them. And how all this was going down as they were worshiping the moon god, the god of sin, or the god named Sin. I found it interesting that this is another instance where they're worshiping the god of their night. It's at night, and here God is, our God, taking out the strength of this God. It made me think about how many times throughout Scripture do we read about God completely destroying and demolishing any potential faith that people could have in a God that was supposed to be protecting them over this time or this thing. And taking that power back from it. You read about that in Egypt when God destroys all the Egyptian gods, right? Where he shows, no, these gods are nothing. I am the God of power. We see that with Dagon in the book of Judges. You see that with another instance where there were people who said, their God is the God of the hills, while our gods are the gods of the plains. Therefore, if we fight them here, we'll be victorious. But once again, God shows that no matter where I am, I will be the one who's victorious. And all the way up into here, I think God is trying to show to the nations, to his people, that he is the one who is ultimately the God of everything, and no God that man has come up with can actually fight or stand against his power. And it was interesting that what would have been the patron god for them was what ended up being demolished and defeated through God's involvement there with the planning of the attack and everything. And what's another interesting note about this god Sin, he was the patron god of And we know because that was where Abraham came from. And apparently, the god Sin later on showed up in Haran, which is where Terah, Nahor, and Abraham's family settled. And it could be an interesting parallel if the reason why the god Sin became that patron god of Haran was because of the fact that Tahor and his family brought up that worship. Thought that was a potentially interesting connection between the gods of the god of the Sumer civilization of that time. But yeah. We're getting close to the end of time, so I see Walter over there. 1 minute. So are there any closing thoughts or comments?
I had one thought as well. Matthew 23:27, just kind of comparing to the end of Habakkuk, where they're talking about these gods that are, built by man's hands, but there's no life in them. Jesus compares the scribes and the Pharisees. He says, "For you are like whitewashed tombs, which outwardly appear beautiful, but within are full of dead people's bones and uncleanness." So it's a little bit of a stretch in a way, but this group or this sect that a lot of the community would have looked up to and in a sense idolized, he's calling them out and saying, like, there's no life in you. That source of hope is not within these people or within these gods.
Did you find any references where God's judgment on the nations at the end of time is likened to a cup of wine? I can't think of any off the top of my head, but could you have an idea?
There are a couple in relation to, we see it in what Jeremiah pulls out in both 51 and in 25, but later on in Revelation, there's a couple instances where it talks about God's wrath being poured out like wine, coming from the cup. And that would have been found in chapters 14, 16, 17, and 18 as well. Some of those are more in relation to the cup of Babylon, but there are scattered throughout there also the cup that comes from God's hand in relation to this. Actually thinking, Revelation 18 kind of has the pairing of the two, but 14 and 17 were both good ones as well. Comments, and I will hand it back over to Dan.